You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another session of PAS 892, Exemplary Practices in Catholic Teaching and Learning. My name is Dr. Sebastian Mahfoud, and we have quite a treat for you today. But first, Father Peter, would you lead us in prayer?
Sure. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Lord, help us to listen to the Holy Spirit working through our presenter, Joseph Pearce, and may we take what we can learn from him in order to make our school according to best practices and, of course, solidly Catholic. We ask this through the intercession of the Blessed Mother and all the saints. Amen. In the name of the Father,
Amen.
the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you, Father Peter. So, Professor Joseph Pearce is a man who needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway, and it's going to be a much truncated version of his actual biography, which is itself. One day, if you don't mind, I will be your official biographer, and we will write a very impressive book. So, about Joseph Pearce. A native of England, Joseph Pearce is the internationally acclaimed author of many books, which include bestsellers such as The Quest for Shakespeare, Tolkien, Man and Myth, The Unmasking of Oscar Wilde, C.S. Lewis, and the Catholic Church, Literary Converts, Wisdom and Innocence, A Life of G.K. Chesterton, Solzhenitsyn, A Soul in Exile in Old Thunder, A Life of Hilaire Belloc. I have crushed these titles together, I'm aware, but I will plod on. His books have been published and translated into Spanish, Portuguese, French, Dutch, Italian, Korean, Mandarin, Croatian, and Polish.
Wow.
Director of book publishing at the Augustine Institute, and editor of the St. Austin Review, series editor of the Ignatius Critical Editions, senior instructor with Homeschool Connections, and senior contributor at the Imaginative Conservative. That is a lot. Without further ado, I give you Professor Pearce. Welcome.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I've obviously I've worked with you in the past and admire what you're doing. So thanks for the invitation. So I will speak for the next 20 or 25 minutes or so on the place of literature, literary studies within the modern educational curriculum. And then we'll have a Q&A session. So that might be fun. So maybe be thinking of good but not too difficult questions over the next 25 minutes or so to enliven the latter half of the hour. Well, first of all, in discussing the place of literature, I'm going to be a little bit controversial, at least until I explain. And that I'm going to say that literature is one of the most important of the sciences. Now, I'm saying that, of course, with an older understanding of what science is. The Latin word scientia, of course, just means knowledge. So in that older understanding of the word, the sciences are the different branches of knowledge. That's why in the older understanding, theology was known as the queen of the sciences. And of course, philosophy was known as a science. And in this sense, I'm going to insist that literature is also a science. And we should understand that we live in an age that has truncated the meaning of science, because these days in our materialistic, philosophically speaking, culture, science merely is what the ancients would have called natural philosophy. In other words, the love of wisdom to be learned from nature. And that, of course, is important. And thanks be to God for it. And thanks be to God that those aspects of science are still on the curriculum, natural philosophy or the physical sciences. But I'm going to argue here that literature is a crucial science, one of the most important branches of knowledge within the academy. And that's because of the place of story in human reality. So it's not a question of fact or fiction. It's a question of myth in the older understanding of the word as the Greek word for story, and how we understand the cosmos in which we live by means of stories, the place of story. First of all, history is, from a Christian perspective, his story. It's the means by which God himself reveals himself through the passage of time to those creatures able to be able to comprehend his presence. In other words, those that are made in the image of God, human persons. So history is a means by which God reveals himself to us. And the way that he reveals himself to us on the deepest level is by actually entering the story. The incarnation, of course, is where God himself enters his story, history. And the greatest story ever told, to take a name of a Hollywood film, the greatest story ever told is the life, death, resurrection, and ascension into heaven of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, which doesn't end there. The story is the descent of the Holy Spirit, the founding of the church, and then the church is the mystical body of Jesus Christ, moving through the centuries and revealing God's presence through the passage of time. So, in other words, we cannot extricate our understanding of reality from the telling of story. And within the story, there are stories. And specifically, the role of story has been sanctified by the fact that Christ himself chose to teach some of his most important lessons through the telling of stories. So let's look, for instance, at the story of the prodigal son, the parable of the prodigal son. I don't think I'm being too controversial here when I say that the prodigal son is a work of fiction. The prodigal son never existed. He's a figment of our Lord's imagination. The prodigal son never existed. His father never existed. His brother never existed. The servants never existed. And most shocking of all, even the pigs never existed, right? They're all a part of a work of fiction. And yet that work of fiction is so true that everybody who's heard that story or read that story from the time of Christ, when Christ first told it to those first very fortunate listeners, right through to our present time, whenever that story's been told, it's spoken to us in a profound way. Each of us, when we hear that story, see something of the prodigal son in ourselves, see something of perhaps the forgiving father in ourselves, see something perhaps of the envious brother in ourselves. It speaks to every person in every generation because it speaks the truth, even though it's a work of fiction, sanctified by the greatest storyteller ever, God himself in the person of Jesus Christ. So, for instance, we don't say when we hear that story that the prodigal son is like me. We say that I am like the prodigal son. And actually, in fact, is privileging the fictional character as the archetype of which we are types. So this is how powerful fiction is and is meant to be. So Tolkien, in his famous lecture and essays on fairy stories, says that fairy stories, those most fantastic of all stories, hold up a mirror to man. They show us ourselves. So what exactly is it that literature shows us? Well, it shows us who we are. Ecce homo, behold the man, not the man Christ here, but the man who we are, made in the image of God. Who is man? And I tell you what literature shows us we are not, is we are not Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens is a silly name for us. It's a very modern name for us. The earliest usage of the label Homo sapiens for the human species, if you want to use biological terminology, is only the early 19th century. So just over 200 years ago, before that, when that term was coined. Homo sapiens, of course, means wise man. And anybody who knows anything about the story of humanity, about the history of humanity, knows that wisdom is not our defining characteristic. That every single generation makes the same mistake as previous generations because every generation refuses to learn the lessons of the story, the lessons of history, the lessons of the great books. Every new generation thinks it can start from scratch and knows better than the accumulated wisdom of the ages. So Homo sapiens is not by any means an adequate label for who we are. So let's go back to an older understanding of who we are. And this is where we see how literature has a unique way of manifesting and showing us who we are as human beings. First, the Greek word for us, anthropos. Now, I know that there's arguments about the etymology of this word, but Plato certainly said that it derived from the fact that he who turns upwards. Plato's good enough for me. So that anthropos, the Greek word for man, is that we look up. And I sometimes express this in this way, that the animal grazes, but man gazes. In other words, the animal is face down, looking at the grass, a slave to instinct. Where man, of course, also has instinct, but we're not slaves to it. We can look beyond it. So I sometimes say to my students that, in what way are we larger and more powerful than the sun? I mean, obviously the sun is more powerful in terms of pure physics, but in terms of metaphysics, it has about as much power as a pebble, a speck of dust. It's an inanimate object that's not aware of its own existence, not aware of the existence of anything else. It's on the same level metaphysically as all other inanimate objects. I can't personally, but other human beings can calculate how far we are from the sun, how long it takes light to get to us from the sun. We can work that out. The sun can't work out how far we are from it. We can write a sonnet to the sun, as indeed many poets have. And one of my favorite poems to the sun was a sonnet written by Roy Campbell, the convert poet. Just the first few lines of it. He at the time of his conversion to Catholicism, he said, "Oh, let your shining orb grow dim of Christ the mirror and the shield, that I may gaze through you to him, see half the miracle revealed." A man can write a sonnet to the sun. The sun can't make a sonnet to us. So we look up in wonder. And again, Thomas Aquinas shows us that the way that we perceive reality is basically effectively fivefold. It begins with virtue, and particularly the virtue of humility. And it's having humility which gives us a sense of gratitude. And it's gratitude that opens the eyes in wonder. And it's wonder that leads us to contemplation. And it's contemplation that dilatatio, dilates the mind of the soul into the fullness of reality. So that fivefold: humility, gratitude, wonder, contemplation, dilation. Now, that mode of engaging with the real, with reality, is exactly what poetry does. Just seen that sonnet to the sun I just mentioned by Roy Campbell. If you want some homework, if you want to see how this plays itself out, read Hymn Before Sunrise in the Vale of Chamonix by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, which is how Coleridge sees Mont Blanc in the Swiss Alps at sunrise, and how he's moved to contemplation and then this dilation, which produces this beautiful work of poetry. So in the broadest sense of the word, literature can be divided into two types. There's what we might call the lyrical, that which sings, such as that poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the work of Anthropos, he who turns up in wonder and contemplation, and whose mind and soul and imaginative faculties are dilated into the fullness of reality. The lyrical aspect of literature. But the other aspect of literature is the narrative aspect. And this brings us into the second definition of who we are, which is homo viator. Not homo sapiens, which is a dumb word for us, but homo viator. Man on a journey, man on a quest, man on a pilgrimage. That each of our lives has a purpose and a goal, and each of our lives is a journey towards that goal, or it's meant to be, or it's a refusal to take the quest with the consequences involved in doing that. In the great works by Tolkien, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, that's exactly what the hobbits have to become. They have to become Homo Viator. Bilbo Baggins has to escape from his comfort zone in his hobbit hole and take the adventure, which is perilous. As Gandalf says, it will do you a great deal of good if you survive. It's a deadly quest, but it's necessary. He learns by leaving his comfort zone that he's actually had the dragon sickness. The dragon sickness basically is being possessed by our possessions. So Smaug, the dragon, is addicted to his possessions, squatting on a huge pile of treasure under the mountain. Bilbo Baggins, at the beginning of the story, is also addicted to his treasure, squatting on a small amount of treasure in his hobbit hole under the hill. And I sometimes say jokingly and punningly and groan-inducingly, that the only difference between Bilbo Baggins and Smaug is one of scale, as in not just size, but dragons. So the Hobbit is a meditation in wonder on St. Matthew's Gospel. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So Homo Viator, as depicted in literature, who we should be, who we are called to be, on a journey, on a pilgrimage, on a quest with the goal of getting to heaven, which is the only purpose any of us have in life. If we fail in that purpose, we are literally miserable losers. So the whole narrative, telling the truth in terms of story, from Christ himself to humble hobbits, is the way we come to the truth. But there's another aspect of who we are that's depicted very well in literature, and that's Homo Superbus, proud man who will worship no one but himself, man who refuses the self-sacrificial path of love, which is the journey that leads to heaven, in order to be selfish instead of selfless. Instead of sacrificing himself for others, he sacrifices others to the self. This is the inversion and perversion of who we're called to be, Homo Superbus. So from the earliest times of Western literature, from Homer, in the Iliad, we are shown Homo Superbus. We are told in the opening lines of the Iliad. First of all, the poet sings to the muse, to the goddess, for inspiration, in other words, for the grace, knowing the relationship between the storyteller and the one who gives the power to tell the story. But then he says, sing of the anger of Achilles and its destructiveness, and of the will of Zeus, which is accomplished. Very opening lines. So the Iliad is a story of Homo Superbus, a proud man, and the destructive consequences of pride, and how also, above it all and transcending and transfiguring it all, the will of God is accomplished. The providence, the hand of providence is involved. And then the second great work of Homer, the Odyssey, this is Homo Viator, right? The man on a journey who, through making mistakes, basically Odysseus begins as Homo Superbus, as a proud man, a pirate, a rapist. And then through the experiences of the Odyssey itself, grows in humility so that he's willing to return home, not in glory, but as a beggar. So we get in that these old, even pre-Christian works, this understanding of Homo Viator, the man on an Odyssey, and Homo Superbus, the proud man who reaps destruction. So what literature does is one of the sciences, one of the branches of knowledge. It shows us who we are. It shows us who we should be. And it also shows us how in each of our own individual life stories, gaining inspiration from those other stories that are out there in the great literature of Western civilization, how in each of our individual life stories we can learn how to live, and not just live, but to live happily. And not just to live happily, but to live happily ever after. The end of all good stories. Thank you. I mean, look, I came in a little bit short there. I'm sorry. It's hard to know how long it's going to take. But more time for questions.
Yeah, exactly. I was about to say. So, gracious host that I am, hopefully a homo viator rather than a homo superbus, I will allow the floor to pose the first questions. So, and I took some decent notes of my own. Does anybody have a thought or a comment or a question they would like to put out there?
Of course, 25 minutes for questions, if there aren't any, is going to be
well, I can talk about poetry a little bit, because there was one book that Professor Pearce has written about that you hadn't mentioned, and that's the poetry of Siegfried Sassoon during the very significant World War I. I met Professor Pearce when he gave a lecture over at the Knights of Columbus in New Haven, Connecticut a few years back, as part of a colloquium that they had on World War I, a huge exhibit, many speakers. And the poetry that's reflected in this military time, so deep, and I found it fascinating that you, after knowing your writings, chose to do that, as well as to produce a play, which unfortunately I was unable to attend. And so maybe you could comment on the depth of that particular poetry, what that narrative and those stories had on where they came from in your life.
Absolutely. Well, obviously, World War I was the first great war of the machines, where basically, because of so-called progress in technology, we now had the ability to make weapons of mass destruction, and how those weapons of mass destruction were unleashed upon defenseless people during the war. The soldiers now basically were just being shot down, shelled down, machine gunned down, poison gassed. So it was necessary, I think, that the voice of protest be raised, and it's significant that the most powerful voices of protest were the voices of the poets. And Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, and their poetry of the experience of World War I, did more probably than anything to turn people against the horrors of that techno warfare. And my play, as you've been kind enough to mention it, which ran for a few weeks off Broadway about four or so years ago, it's called Death Comes for the War Poets. And the beautiful thing you can do in drama is that there were three characters, just Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, but the third character was a woman whose name was Death. And Death begins as an old hag, sort of similar to the weird sisters in Macbeth, threatening, witch-like. When Sassoon and Owen are non-believers, Death is this hideous thing. And then Sassoon, of course, comes through his experience of suffering to an acceptance and embrace of Christ. And then his conversion also leads to the conversion of Death, who at the end is basically angelic. So you could talk about these metaphysics and using the poetry of great poets such as Sassoon to teach, hopefully without being too preachy. But certainly I was very, very pleased that the play got very good reviews from secular critics in New York City, just not the most friendly place for Catholics. So it does show that. I think it shows the power of literature. So thank you for asking that question.
Okay, we won't call in people. Just throw yourselves out there if you've got something you want to ask. I have one question. You have, if you would indulge us a little bit, a statue above your head on the left. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I have several. We've just talked before. I'll get to the one you're talking about in a moment, but just above me, right at the top, you can see the bottom part of it is a map of Middle Earth. Obviously, over my left shoulder is G.K. Chesterton. Here is the 40 Martyrs of England and Wales. There's some pictures of my family. This is William Shakespeare. But this is the person I think you were talking about. So I'll bring her down. This actually is Beatrice, who's a great inspirational figure for me, as actually is Homer's Penelope. But I edited an anthology of poetry called and there's Dante. Here we have Dante. Here, bring the two together. Yeah.
It's like the Purgatorio in Canto 30.
Yeah, there we go. So they're not allowed to kiss because Dante and Beatrice don't kiss, but they can at least, look at each other's eyes, right? There we go.
They can't shake hands because,
But I edited an anthology of poetry that was subtitled in the original edition 1,000 Years of Christian Verse, but it's now published as Poems Every Catholic Should Know. But I dedicated it to Beatrice. And this Beatrice.
Very cool. Do we have anything from the world of philosophy that we can toss in here, Alan?
No, but can you hear me? I was going to ask another question.
Sure.
So I'm just curious, are there any Catholic authors of note around today that you'd recommend? Just because I am in philosophy, I don't know literature that well. So I don't know who current authors would be that would be good to read.
Yeah, I mean, they're actually when I began. So the magazine I edit, this Austin Review, I hope it sort of has a catalytic impact upon contemporary culture, and I've been very encouraged because the magazine's been going for 20 years, and I would say for about the first 10 years. There wasn't much sign of a genuine Catholic literary revival in the 21st century, but I think that's changing. The difficulty we have, I'll give you some names in a moment, but the difficulty we have is that whereas the previous Catholic literary revival, which might be said to have started with Newman and go right through maybe even to the death of Tolkien, so almost 150 years, that these days secular publishers will not touch Christian writers. So in other words, there are some good writers out there who in healthier days would be actually being published by major publishers and probably being read more widely than they are. But I'll give you a few names. I mean, the best-selling Catholic author today is Dean Koontz, who I'm sure you've heard of. And his books are soft Catholicism, not what Lewis would call Christianity in water, not diluted, but just not very deep. Basically, what there is fair enough, but it's not very deep. It won't satisfy a philosopher, that's for sure, or a theologian for that matter. But they're fun and they're healthy. On a deeper level, another New York Times bestseller that I would recommend more thoroughly than Dean Koontz definitely is Tim Powers. And Tim Powers is probably in his 70s now. He's best known to popular culture for writing the novel which became the inspiration for one of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, the one on Stranger Tides. But I wouldn't. I haven't read that, but I know that Tim Powers himself. I said, which of your books? If I want to read one of your books, because you're obviously a sin of omission on my part. What should I read? And he suggested I read a book called Declare, which I read, and it's absolutely marvelous, very Catholic, very historical, lots of very good historical research. It's basically set between the Spanish Civil War, occupied France in World War II, the coming down to the Berlin Wall, Moscow, London, the Middle East, and it's sort of what you might call a supernatural thriller because on the surface it's very realistic, but there's obviously demonic stuff going on. Very deep, very enjoyable. And the other one he wrote that I've read, that he recommended I read, is called Last Call, and that is set between Las Vegas and Los Angeles. And again, it basically shows the demonic underbelly of Las Vegas. And again, very, very well done. So they're best selling. Now, Glenn Asbury, who some of you might know possibly as president of Wyoming Catholic College, has written a couple of recently published novels. I haven't read the newest one yet, although I hope to. But the one before was published about 2 years ago. Is called Bearings and Distances, and that's very philosophical, by the way. The title, Bearings and Distances, is physically about the science of geometry and surveying, but metaphysically it's about the bearings that we have, the orientations that we have, the distances that we have between us, or otherwise. So a very profound work, very dark, would not recommend it to those with a queasy sensibility. But basically what he does, he looks at hedonism and he looks it straight in the eye and stares it down, basically, and shows how ugly and empty and destructive it is, and what a dead end it is. And again, the Catholic presence is there, but with great subtlety. It's a powerful silence. So Chilton Williamson Jr., who was at one point editor of the magazine Chronicles, wrote a novel set in Wyoming, which is also marvelous. And fortunately, at the moment, I can't remember the title of it, which is not much good to you. Obviously, Michael D. O'Brien, of course, is well known. Canadian author. Father Elijah is probably his best known book. And then there's light affairs. See, the thing I say that a literary revival is going to be good, bad, and ugly, right? Because that's what a living culture is, right? You've got to have lots of things being published of various qualities. That's what it is. And so there are some good mystery stories out there now. There's Dina Hunt has published, not Dina Hunt, she's published a history novel called Treason, which I also recommend, set in Elizabethan England during the time of persecution of the priests and the English martyrs. But Lorraine Murray, who's written a series of murder mysteries based in a fictional parish in Atlanta, Georgia. There's actually one called The Death of a Liturgist. The liturgist is murdered, and let's just say that he's such a mess as a liturgist that you're waiting him to be murdered. You want him to be murdered, and then you don't want the culprit to be caught afterwards. But it's a humour, light, and there's Barbara Golder does medical mysteries, murder mysteries dealing with bioethical issues, and there's a whole host of very good Catholic poets out there now. I've got shelves of contemporary volumes of Catholic poetry. The trouble is, as I said, very few people know about this. There's an Austin Review that I edit is a good place to go to be keeping your finger on the pulse of what's new is happening in Catholic culture today. As is another magazine I would recommend called Dappled Things. So that actually publishes contemporary Catholic poetry and short fiction.
Could I ask a question?
As does Austin Review.
Sebastian, could I ask a question?
Oh, please do.
Yeah, so we are to be in line with the church to promote the new evangelization. And I think at Holy Apostles, we are quite strong with respect to dogma and morals. At the same time, I think if we continue to develop and we have a future, we should also try to evangelize the culture along with that as the core, but also through poetry, through literature, through creativity. Because I studied a little bit of Rules of Radicals when I was in graduate school with Saul Alinsky, and you probably know him better than I do. I'm not, it was just part of the whole, part of my program a little bit. But what interests me about Saul Alinsky is he didn't care about truth. He didn't want people to argue. He didn't care about that. What he wanted, at least this is what my general sense of him, Does he encourage people to change the culture? Forget about arguing with people on truth or if people hold this dogmatic. Forget that. Just change the arts, change the medias. At least that was my takeaway from some ways that Saul Alinsky would try to radically change and undermine a particular culture and many of his followers. Well, we don't want to become Saul Alinsky followers, of course not. But at the same time we also want to evangelize through morals, through dogmas, and also through changing the culture, such as all those wonderful people you said, the stories. Do you see what I'm saying? I'm sure you can say it better than I can, but I'm wondering if at Holy Apostles, if there's a way we can have both and.
Well, I would certainly to address the last thing you said first, and then I'll answer your question thereafter. I would be absolutely overjoyed if Holy Apostles could be at the forefront of the avant-garde of a new cultural revival through its engagement with what's good and contemporary in the arts, Catholic arts, and also, of course, in making Catholic literature, Catholic music, the Catholic visual arts. There's also many great Catholic artists and musicians out there now. So that warms my heart to hear you say that. Just to know that sort of philosophy is in your mind, and if I can help, let me know. Basically, and I'll give you some practical examples. One of the big mistakes that so-called conservatives have made, and I don't like using the word, is they think it's all about politics. And wise people know that politics is downstream from culture. And if you change the culture, you'll get the politics that actually reflects the culture further downstream. And this has been, I can show you practical examples that although Franco's nationalists won the Spanish Civil War, the Marxists were not able to be active in politics, but they became very active in culture. And by the time that Franco died, Spain had been transformed into a liberal secularist culture, basically through this cultural revolution that had been going on for the previous 30 years. On the other side of the coin, look at what was happening in samizdat, in the unpublished manuscripts in the Soviet Union and the communist countries during the 20th century, figures such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and in countries like Poland, where the anti-communism basically became the grassroots culture of the people. And so it became untenable because no one except the professional politicians and bureaucrats believed it any longer. And that was because it was a cultural struggle that had been won by, in this case, by the anti-communists. So if we actually want to transform and transfigure the culture of the United States, or the culture of the world for that matter, we have to be embracing and advocating a cultural revival. We have to be looking at the visual arts. We have to be looking at music and literature as a means of changing hearts and minds. And just to try to see this in a philosophical way of looking at it. I give a talk often on evangelizing through the power of beauty. So this is close to my heart. So I have to be careful not to give a second talk here. I'll keep this to 3 minutes. The transcendentals, the philosophical transcendentals of the good, the true, and the beautiful. The good is virtue or love, the true is reason, and the beautiful, I would say, is creation, both primal creation, looking out the window now, trees, but also at sub-creation, as Tolkien would call it. We, as sub-creators, made in the image of God. We made in the image of God because we can love as God loves, we can reason as God reasons, but we can also create as God creates. And in a relativistic age, virtue, first of all, the word virtue has been banned from the vocabulary, so it's not even being talked about. Love has become something which is a Christian understanding of love is a rational choice to lay down your life for the other. So love is not divorced from reason. But in the modern world, love is a feeling and emotion, and therefore implicitly irrational. So in a world that doesn't know what true love is, in a world that now has embraced relativism, which does not know what objective truth is, and the importance of reason in acquiring objective truth, what you have left is beauty. and that's the way I sometimes put this to people, is you could take a Catholic, a Protestant, a Jew, an agnostic, an atheist, and take them out in the middle of the night and set them down in a field in the dark. And they're all facing east. When they see the light change and the colors change, the sun's about to rise and the red spreading across the horizon, all of them will think it is good that we are here. And that thought of good we are here leads to that sense of gratitude, which leads to wonder, and that's the seedbed for contemplation. So that's the place where the different philosophies can meet with the kiss of beauty.
Thank
I'd
you.
like to suggest an American Catholic author that I think I find with some of the students I've spoken with, the Holy Apostles, they're very big on him, and I find a lot of Thomists today have discovered him in the last 30 years. It's really worth looking at, is Walker Percy.
Yes.
I think that more than any other Catholic author in the last 100 years has been able to bridge philosophy, theology, and the humanities. And at least for Catholic philosophy, and I as a Thomist find that the one place that Walker Percy really opened a lot of doors for me was that in my graduate work, I did my master's degree in sociology of religion, and was very much into Ernst Cassirer in discovering man as a symbolic being. And it was Percy who then, when I got into Thomism, bridged me back into combining my Thomism with the symbolic part of the human being. And the point I'm trying to get at is, if we are going to evangelize as intellectuals, because I think what Francis is talking about when he talks about evangelization is really human development. I think that's very much his approach to it. And to do that, you have to have a sense of the humanities intellectually. And it is Walker Percy, as a Catholic author, in his novels, but then especially in his last book, where he really brings out his philosophy, Symbol and Existence, begins to pull all that together. And I think he's one Catholic author who, besides being a brilliant author, is also a brilliant philosopher. And he really should be embedded in our courses on literature and in our courses on philosophy as well. For example, Thomas Aquinas' degree was in the humanities. It wasn't in philosophy.
And he was a great poet.
Saying, Professor, it all starts with wonder. For example, before I got into anything, I was, as a young person, I'm also a jazz musician, all right? And listen to John Coltrane. That's where you discover wonder in philosophy as much as you do in literature. So yes, evangelization starts in wonder, but it all starts with the humanities. That's the bridge between them all.
Yeah, I would say one thing, just by way of explanation, that I agree with you completely about Walker Percy, who's marvelous. And I write about in my book, Literature What Every Catholic Should Know, and every Catholic should know Walker Percy, and I state that explicitly. But the question I think I was being asked by your colleague was contemporary, as in still alive. Although Walker Percy's late 20th century, he's not still alive, so that's why I didn't mention him. Not because I don't think he's worthy of mention. The one thing, this isn't the time for it, but one, as you're a Thomist, one conversation I'd love to have with you or other Thomistic admirers of Walker Percy at some point is what Walker Percy does with Kierkegaard. Because Kierkegaard is obviously a major influence on Walker Percy. He's obviously clearly Thomistic in his understanding of the cosmos as well. So it'd be very interesting to have a conversation on this. Is not the time for it, obviously, because that's a 2-hour conversation over beer, ideally.
We can host that in Zoom. We'll just have people come. Everybody's got to bring their own beer.
That sounds good.
We're doing it on a Friday night.
A virtual pub. I like that.
I don't drink.
Question.
Right. Charles, go ahead.
I have a question. But first, I want to make the observation that so far I've heard I've not heard any voices of women, and I'm wondering, in some circles that would be not surprising because that's the way y'all are supposed to be. But my sense is that's not the case in this group. So I'm wondering if one of y'all has something to say. I have a very different kind of a question, so I invite the other side to speak.
Oh, well, we started out though with Claire, one of your fellow librarians.
I heard that, but that's.
Let me say something. Obviously, the vast majority of my talk was on abstract understandings of who we are as man, and obviously that goes without saying. I was using man inclusively there. That Homo viator, Homo sapiens, Homo superbus refer to the whole of the human species, male and female. So that was absolutely inclusive in that sense, and I'm sure that you know that, and that's not the nature of your question. The prodigal son story does not only apply to sons but to daughters. Again, all of that is implicit. As regards mentioning women, when the contemporary authors, I mentioned Dina Hunt and Barbara Golder, both contemporary Catholic authors that write very good mystery stories. I must confess that when I originally edited my anthology of 1,000 Years of Christian Verse, I was peeved when the secular publisher in the UK, because it was published by a secular publisher first of all, insisted I put female poets in to increase the proportion of the female representation regardless of quality. Now, I have no doubt at all that in terms of the novel, the Bronte sisters, Jane Austen, who's one of the great philosophers, was one of the great storytellers, that George Eliot, the women, Flannery O'Connor, that's a sin of omission, that the women are great storytellers, particularly in the genre of the novel. But there are relatively few great female poets, and I'm not interested in discussing why. But I was annoyed that I was expected to basically make weight by basically removing good poetry to allow inferior poetry to be included merely because it was written by a woman. We talked about beauty here, and it's not dictated by male or female. It's about what is good.
All right, I do have a substantive question, but I want to make another observation before I go to do that. And that is that walking into this conversation or sitting down here and having this conversation start around me, as it were, has been an extraordinary experience. And I don't know whether y'all are aware of it or not, but in your conversations, from just about everybody that spoke, everything was, quote, Catholic. And it was not only Catholic, it was identified as Catholic. I mean, it's though there was a Catholic veneer, a Catholic window, a Catholic telescope, a Catholic mirror, through which everything was both reflected and articulated and spoken. And I just, if this room were populated by Protestants, you wouldn't hear the word Protestant mentioned at all. And I'm not prepared to expound on that. I just am pointing that out as an observation from a clear outsider to this inner conversation, what it sounds like.
Can I again, I know you're addressing the whole conversation, not just my part of it, but I would like to say that when we are talking about who we are, then having a true objective understanding of Homo viator and Anthropos is rooted in a Platonic, Aristotelian, Augustinian, Thomistic understanding of the human person that is Catholic in both senses of the word, Catholic with an uppercase C, but also Catholic as in being universal. That we do have to understand who we are, and we're not relativistic, random assemblages of atoms. And if we believe that, we'll be nihilistic and existentialist, and we'll have a completely different literature. So it's absolutely crucial to get our cosmology and our anthropology correct.
All I'm saying is that Protestants wouldn't need, in conversations like this, if they were all Protestants, or even if there were some Catholics there, to say, this is Protestant. I'm not saying that's a bad thing or a good thing. I'm simply offering it as an observation about the significant oral difference in this conversation from a similar conversation that would have been held about the same things, involving highly likely many, if not all, of the same people, figures in history, writers, philosophers, believers. It wouldn't have all been tagged Catholic. That's all I'm saying. That's not a complaint. That's just an observation of how we are from, in some ways, different worlds. Here was my question. I wanted to ask, and I'm going to ask it in a weird way, but I'm not getting that there's a difference between fact and fiction.
Okay, is that your question?
Yes.
There is a difference between fact and fiction, but neither fact nor fiction are the same thing as truth. So the point is that which is true, a fact is the grass out there at the moment is more brown than it will be in about 2 months from now. If that's fact. All facts are true, but I would say that most facts are merely true on the material level. That if we start talking about metaphysics, such as what is love, how do you start describing what is love in terms of facts? You only can understand what love is in terms of metaphysics, and metaphysics is best expressed in terms of story, as our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ shows us in his parables. And I did mention the prodigal son as a work of fiction, which is profoundly true.
But it's not a fact.
No, but it's profoundly true.
I accept that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's a good distinction to introduce Robert Hanley, who has joined us. Robert, before you arrived at today's meeting, Joseph said that stories have been sanctified by Christ having preached through stories. And he then added later that holy apostles should be at the forefront of the avant-garde on advancing, is it our ethos, our Catholic ethos, or who Catholics are through the stories that we tell?
Yeah, the cultural apologetics, basically bringing people to the truth through the power of beauty.
Robert, do you have anything to say about that?
Thank you for giving me some background on everything. I'm so sorry that I couldn't come in. I got a phone call from my brother who's having some mental issues, and that's not an excuse. Well, maybe it is an excuse, but it was a viable excuse. So my apologies for attending late. Before I get to the storytelling, or maybe I could tie it into what Charles and Professor Pearce were discussing. Sometimes when we all, I don't know all your backgrounds, but when I have spoken to groups or performed in front of groups as an entertainer, as an actor, one statement that comes to my mind is know your audience. The audience here would seem to me, and I don't know this to be true, but basically Catholic. And when I have spoken in my storytelling, and when we are having a Zoom meeting like this, I often mention, and it's in our purpose, our mission statement, if you will, an extension of it, that whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. So, and I mention it's open to people of all faiths. And what I garner from Charles, your question about, Protestants wouldn't mention Protestants and Catholics wouldn't mention Catholics. I doubt Protestants would, well, whatever. I think that's kind of, Christ taught us to love, and that's what I go by. And your example, Professor Pearce, of the sun coming up, Norman Lear has a statement. It says, I'm just another version of you. And I think that kind of sums up what you were talking about, or what I'm talking about. Let me not put words in either of your mouths. I mention frequently where I say, as Catholics or as Christians or as, the basic tenets of most faiths are pretty close to what we're doing here. So I think it's something you run into. I don't know that there's anything wrong with that. I think Charles said that there's nothing wrong with that. I don't find anything wrong with it. And sometimes it's just the person who's speaking, happens to recognize who he's speaking to, and maybe that he or she could get their points across. As far as storytelling, I do write stories, and in the book that I've written, I mentioned everyday events, and these everyday events that I put out to people seem to reach people in a general way that's universal to us all. Chapter might be about change. It might be about the value of work. It might be about humor. It might be about perseverance. Not might be, they are. Providence. So these are things, again, to what I was just referring to. We're all in the same boat, so to speak. These are things that everybody can relate to in everyday events. And for the stories that I write, sometimes they just deal with me being in a gasoline station. And I lost my credit card, and I'm looking all over, and the attendant's looking all over. And then finally I find it, and I say to myself, how can I apply that to my own life as a, why do we play it safe? As a person of God, man of faith, as the man of faith. And, where does change come into my life? And in a subsequent group, the Zoom I alluded to earlier, we address it from a spiritual standpoint, not necessarily Catholic, but certainly Christian. And sometimes there are quotes from the Old Testament. And I would welcome anybody, as I think Professor Pearce would welcome anybody, or you, Charles, you would welcome people. So in that case, I often mention people of, any faith could relate to this, even though we're talking about an everyday event and telling a story that I hope is engaging, entertaining, and educational, having nothing to do with my faith. And some of the stories do have to do with my faith. And I'm noticing that there was somebody on here earlier that has a radio show, and she had me on, and I mentioned in a regular story for me, I was up for an audition for a De Niro and Pacino film, and I had gone on many auditions before, but this was something because those two actors were renowned, as most of you probably know. But when the text came in, when the sides came in for the script, it contained curse words, profanity in the scenes that I was going into audition for. And it was a conundrum. What am I going to do? This is a great opportunity. On the other hand, I don't like profanity. And that story alone and my choice, just dealing with the fact that all of us come to that crossroads where we are faced with something that is a challenge. Which way do we go? Why do we have confession? There would be no need for confession if we were all perfect in that regard. And what I chose was tough for me. And I am an active Catholic. I mean, very involved in my parish, have been for decades. And still it was a challenge for me. But in the end, I chose not to, when the camera was on and we did 2 scenes, I kept the profanity out. Then relating it to, and that particular story deals with not only my faith, but with my career. I just happened to be in show business. If I was a doctor, I could talk about, do I have an abortion for somebody or don't I? And 4 kids. I'm just saying somebody somewhere might, and a priest asked me that once. He said to me, Robert, what would you do? I told him to do the best he could do under the circumstances because he has 4 children. What do you do? My point is not what he did, but my point is people in other fields have the same challenges that I do. The topics are universal. So then go to the Bible. And what do we have to change in our lives? Well, Christ says, here's what you have to change. You got to start, as this was just in the gospel. Peter, you're no longer going to be fishing for fish. You're going to be a fisherman of men. What else do you have to do? Well, you have to, this is not good. You need to stop this. And here's what you have to do, with quotes in the Bible or quoting saints. So I put the two together, and a lot of that is based for people who are seeking God, putting those two stories together, and those people who already believe in God that relates to their everyday life, first of all. And the story with De Niro and Pacino, for me, as odd as that may be from what your respective jobs are, your careers are in life. And how do we look at it from what Christ has taught us and what the saints have taught us? And educators like some of you, here in this webinar, or I guess it's not a webinar, a Zoom meeting. So there's something to be learned there. And I think the story is what brings people to our faith or to God. I had an agnostic write he said he wasn't going to, when he got to a few stories in my book, he said, I was challenged here. I don't know the guy. I gave him the book, and he said, I wasn't sure if I was going to keep reading, but I did. And I'm glad I did. And he went on, he said, I recognized that this was a man of God, a man of faith. So the idea that something I wrote got an agnostic to pick it up and read it, where it mentions, like in that story and in a handful of others that deal with in the first, everyday story. I prayed on the way to the audition at Hollywood Warner Studios in Hollywood in my 66 Mustang. I remember it like it was yesterday. And I said, God, I want to do your will. Go with me into this audition. Be with me. Now that guy, I think that's about the third story or fourth story in the book. That guy could have stopped there, because as soon as you mention God or spiritual things, he decided to keep reading. Or maybe he finished that story because the idea that somebody who is going to be in a film, or possibly be in a film, with De Niro and Pacino interests him. So storytelling does not have to knock somebody over the head with faith, because there's a story of me meeting a woman in an antique store, and it talks about how work and the work required, and hopefully people find that interesting. But that story does not have to do with faith, but it keeps people reading. And the stories that are having to do with faith probably scratched their head, as this guy did, and went on to give me a nice review of the book saying, I'm glad I read the book. So Catholic, Protestant, storytelling, for me, I know what I was after. I wrote this to help people, my book, and I use storytelling, and I use it in my life. Started in an acting class where I had an acting studio, and I'm going to be quiet, and I promise you in 30 seconds. And I'd come into class and I'd say, I was at church yesterday, and I blah, 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 whatever. And I was just relating an incident. These actors in Hollywood, they're not going to church, but their acting teacher used the word, I went to church yesterday. So those kinds of things that we sometimes hold back, that we can just talk to people and say, this is what I did. It grabs them. And if you want to add to that, put in the spirituality aspect. Thank you for introducing me, Sebastian. I'm so sorry I missed.
No, that is good. And like a great Greek playwright, I have thrown you in medias res. That is, I forgot to point out to Professor Pearce that Robert Hanley is a Catholic actor and an author. of Do You See What I See? Discovering the Obvious, which is exactly what you were talking about in terms, Joseph, of the being on the avant-garde and engaging through story people back into their faith. So Robert has a show called the Fireside Fellowship. He brings people in and they have excellent conversations about this book. I'll need to give you a more formal introduction later. But
Please
I
do.
just want to add something before anybody interjects. I did not come here, and I'm not interested in pitching the book or the Fireside Fellowship. I had no idea he was going to do that, and he does that, and I always feel somewhat embarrassed. It starts a fire in me, though, to hear what you were saying, Professor Pearce, and Charles, only adding to my dismay that I wasn't able to be here sooner. So that's what grabs me, and that's why I'm here. I'm not showing you my book to buy the book. However, if you call in,
well, with that, Professor Pearce, would you like to? Do you have any final words or any final thoughts for us? I know that we're just past our time.
Just that it's been a joy for me to share this hour with you. Keep up the great work you're doing at Holy Apostles, because you're doing very valuable work. I'm pleased to be involved, albeit just on the periphery, shall we say, and I'm very honored to have had this invitation. So thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. Marianne, would you close us in prayer?
Sure. Real quick, first, I wanted to say thank you to Professor Pearce. I admire you and your work greatly. I've been a subscriber to St. Austin Review for about 3 years, and your comments on the transcendentals are something that are near and dear to my heart as a Catholic bioethicist. I use the transcendentals, demonstrating that from the moment of conception, we are an icon of written by the hand of God, and that goodness, truth, and beauty is right there from the very beginning to the very, very end. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Dear God in heaven, thank you for allowing us to gather here today and learn from Professor Pearce. As we journey toward you, help us to use the gift of story and literature to seek you. In seeking authentic wisdom, may we find ourselves as we journey toward you, and may we be granted the gift of sharing the journey and the faith which propels it with our students, colleagues, and the community as we come to rest in your providential mercy and love. Please bless Professor Pearce, his work, his loved ones, and students, and we ask this through the intercession of Our Lady, the ever immaculate and all pure, Blessed Virgin Mary. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marion. Thank you, Professor Pearce, and everybody for coming. We'll join back next week with Charles Willard, who will be talking about libraries and all wonderful things related to books to pick up conversation. So we'll see everybody next time. God bless, and goodbye.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.